Hello and thanks for tuning in to the Architect and Interior Designer podcast. Not sure if tuning in is the right term, but this is going to be an interesting one today. Over some wine, in my case, and some scotch in the case of my guest, we're going to do a little bit of a rave, a random architectural rave. Two very opinionated men. Let's see what we decide to talk about. And I hope you find it interesting. We'll try and keep it short. Let's see how we go.
The Architect and Interior Design Show would not be possible without the support of our official partner, Studio Bagno, the architect's choice for bathware. Book a product presentation for your practice with Tony Rowlands at studiobagno.com.au.
Well, my guest today is Koos de Keijzer, the principal of DKO Architecture. And there we go. In vino veritas, I think, in wine the truth, or something like that. Let's see how we go. Have a sip.
Cheers,
so
Tony.
what we're going to do is do some cheers. Is something a bit random about architecture. Things that we think, and we're both very opinionated guys, I think, so let's see if we can agree on anything or agree to disagree. Have you got a subject you want to bring up?
No, but I have been travelling a bit lately, and I've did a little skip through Europe in October and New York, and I saw some fabulous architecture. And what struck me is that what's really interesting me is that architecture that touches the public realm is actually really interesting, and it kind of touches it. You can walk through it, you can touch it, and it does something to your soul. And I took my wife on the High Line in New York that I've walked down many, many times, but it's always been extended. And you now got the Hudson Yards on the northern end, and it's such a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
And then there's also this new park they built in the Hudson River called the Island, which is almost like a series of wine glasses that are just in the
That's that huge sculpture?
And
yeah.
You walk through it and say, this is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm kind of intrigued by how those things actually start, because they are really great projects that add something to the city. I've always felt here in Sydney, probably wrongly, that a lot of the park at the end of Barangaroo, because it's artificially built.
Yes.
And I've always said, But even I was walking there a few weeks ago, and I said, this is really quite good, even though it's not really authentic.
I think it is bloody good, but I've seen the renderings for the other bit of park that's coming on in the foreground there at Barangaroo, and I think it's bloody awful. But that's another story. But I like what you brought up there, which is that urban environment, and I think there's so much more we could do, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. We seem so obsessed with high-rise, and yet when I go to Europe, and you do see it in the United States, in New York and Chicago as well, the scale of buildings, 4 to 6 levels, which seems so much more human and accessible and attractive. And so why we're not doing that kind of urban density here, say 4 to 6 levels, I don't damn well know.
I think it's changing. I think the pressures on housing affordability, certainly in Sydney and Melbourne, I think that the whole concept of re-looking at density, having 4 to 6 buildings adjacent to a railway station, I think finally people are starting to realise that if our cities are going to grow, that's the only way that a city can grow.
Absolutely.
It can't grow up. It can't grow out.
Yeah.
It has to grow up. And really, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane are these sprawling cities, some of the largest cities in the world of single and 2-story homes.
It's gaga.
You know, I'm still very proud of the fact that a Penrith is 64k, I think, from the GPO in Sydney. We've done 6 8-story apartments in Penrith next to the railway station, and there's a sense of urbanness.
That's what I'm talking about.
That actually is really cool.
Yeah, and I think that height actually makes that happen too. You know, another thing that I love to see, which you run into in Italy all the time, and with the changing climate, is colonnades. I'd love to see more colonnades. We don't have them. There's no sunshades in the inner cities, but those colonnades, and they come right out to the curb in Italy, and miraculously people don't seem to crash into them. So you'd hope that the same thing could happen here. But they're another human, lovely experience.
That is a really good point, Tony. And not just the colonnade, but a colonnade that's a good 2 stories tall.
Yes.
It's a 6 to 8 story. You know, if you look at what they did down at Circular Quay on the way to the Opera House, and that was done 30 years ago, but that colonnade that goes down there, they took out that little kind of glazed little thing.
Yeah.
And they've got a colonnade there that's, I think, about 8 metres tall and 3 metres wide. And it's a fabulous space.
It's a beautiful space.
And I think a lot of people don't like it in Australia because it actually takes out leasable retail area. But I think it's a really friendly edge to the street. It does something really nice.
And that's, I mean, the thing that always gets me here is street activation, of which there really isn't as much. You know, I mean, you can go to a small town in Italy of 5,000 people and everybody's out at night. I know they all promenade and all that sort of stuff, but there doesn't seem to be any incentive architecturally in Australia to actually come out and walk around under a colonnade or in a square or whatever.
It's kind of interesting. There's been some research done that certainly in Australia the kind of basic planning ethos is if you've got a tall building that touches the ground, it has to have a retail interface because that's the only way of activating the street. I don't agree with that.
It's definitely not.
And certainly if you look at Melbourne, I think Melbourne has like 5.5k of empty retail space at ground level. So it says, well, how else can you activate the street?
Yeah.
I kind of love the concept of a stoop.
Yes.
In New York, you have the brownstone. You can walk through Brooklyn, and at 6 p.m. you can have whole families that sit on the brownstone steps that actually look
Same in Chicago.
past,
Yeah.
and that talk to you, and it's not just a shop.
Yeah.
And I think in Australia we've become obsessed with the concept of activating a street with a retail edge, again, because it makes you money, you can rent it out, so it's worth something. But I don't think it's working.
I'm sure it's not working. How many 7-Elevens or whatever they are can you possibly have where people get hammered into bankruptcy?
Exactly.
It's crazy. And it isn't that human scale that we're both actually talking about that actually makes you want to come out and walk around. No, it strikes me as absolutely bloody nuts. You know, another thing, it's about time. Well, you did that subject, didn't you?
What subject?
You brought that subject up.
Which one was that?
Well, let's go to something. I tell you one thing that I love to say in Mexico, and that's missing here, was colour. You know,
Mexico
like
City
a
is
purple house next to a pink house, next to a yellow house, next to a green house, and it works. And again, it seems to add that humanity to the streetscape.
Mexico City is probably one of my favourite cities
Gorgeous.
in the world.
Yeah.
It's a very large city. I think it used to, when I was growing up, it was the largest city in the world. I think it's now Tokyo. And Louis Barragan.
Yes.
And those great Mexican architects, the sense of colour, and it's a beautiful kind of terracotta redness that changes colour during the day. When the sun sets, it's a different colour.
And we've got the sun here.
And there's a simplicity and a graphicness there that's actually really great. I'm working on a couple of projects down here in South Sydney, in just off Joynton Avenue, and if you look at all the buildings on the skyline, they're all white.
Yeah.
And beige and white. And
Beige, white, grey.
And there's one that's actually black.
Yeah.
And I keep on looking at one that's black, saying that's really quite cool.
Yeah.
That's actually.
Yeah.
So I think a colour is a really important thing, and I don't. And what's also interesting is that the Indigenous Australians are really obsessed about colour. Also, if you look at their art, it's very colourful, and certainly dealing with a lot of the Indigenous Australians, they're really keen to talk to us about a terracotta building that touches the ground, and as the building goes up it gets lighter and then it touches the sky. So certainly in Indigenous thinking there's a strong emphasis on colour.
Good.
And you fly over Australia from an aeroplane and you look down at the ground and it's this fabulous terracotta red colour that has swirls in it and something kind of, there's something there that's very beautiful.
Well, there is, and we should certainly, as an aside, be talking more to the First Nations people here who've got a lot to tell us.
Every significant project that we do, we have First Nations input right from day one. And we see it as an integral part of our process.
And it's rewarding.
It's really adding value.
Yeah.
But most importantly, it's actually dealing with real-time Indigenous Australian thinking that is really important.
Yeah, and it's I know from various people that I know, First Nations people, that it's out, to a Western mind, it's outside the box, and it's refreshing and and enlightening.
Yeah.
Good.
So certainly a colour, and coming back to Mexico, kind of, I love Louis Barragan's work, and probably from an urban civic point of view, Louis Barragan and a sculptor called Matthias Goetz did this beautiful series of towers on a major highway driving out of Mexico City. And these towers, I think there are 5 or 6 of them, they're all, one's terracotta, one's yellow, one's blue, and they're about 5 stories tall, and they're right in the centre of the highway, and they're powerful.
Well, if that, I'm not familiar with those, but if that works, that's wonderful. But that makes me think of something else, as the towers as public art, which they often become, particularly in Melbourne, where you've got all sorts of designs wending their way up them. And to me, that becomes a little bit problematic, because if they're going to be public art, if it's going to be an enormous sculpture, it had better be good. And I'm not sure a lot of them are.
You've got the DCM one that sits on the Tullamarine Freeway when you drive into Melbourne. I always look at that and say, oh shit, that's clever.
Yeah, no, that's a good one.
It's been there for 30 years, and shit, that's still clever.
There's a couple in Melbourne that I better not name them.
No, I'm keen to know that.
Afterwards, but that just don't sort of work for me. And then Brisbane, that happens a bit as well.
Well, what's interesting, talking about the same thing, certainly in Victoria, they've invested a lot of money into sound walls on freeways. Now, though we shouldn't be building more freeways, but unfortunately, though we are, Woods Marsh, very prominent Melbourne architectural practice, they did some sound walls on the Eastern Freeway that were done like 25 years ago. You drive past them now and you still say, shit, that's clever.
Yeah.
That is really clever.
Well,
and so some of that stuff is actually timeless, and some of the stuff isn't. I think you're right.
Yeah, some of it, but overall, though, you have to say that Australian architects are pretty bloody amazing. I'm going to throw another one at you that I think is kind of interesting. Separating, and I think you can, politics from architecture. I mean, every time I go to Rome, almost every time I go down to where the tomb of Augustus is, if you know that area, and that's a marvellous place, getting rejiggered now, and if they ever finish it, but being Italy, maybe not, it'll be spectacular. But it's surrounded by phenomenal Mussolini era buildings. Of course, they're related essentially to revolting politics. However, the buildings are, in my opinion,
Look,
fantastic.
it's a delicate subject, but certainly the Italian architects in the 1930s and early 40s, the futurists, I think.
Oh, the futurist, yeah.
People like Giuseppe Torrini, who did Casa del Fascista in Como. They're beautiful buildings.
They're exquisite buildings.
They're modern, they're simple, they're graphic, they're strong. Even I was in Naples last year, and the post office.
The post office is if you built it today, it would win an award, wouldn't it? It's magnificent.
This is really cool.
Yeah, I know. It's a spectacular building. And what they seem to have not forgotten is, again, human scale and usability. And the funny thing is, when you contrast that with the same period in Germany, in which there are some good buildings, the idea is the politics really seems to be very strong in the buildings themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at Italian pre-war architecture and German pre-war architecture, the Italian architecture is so much
Leaves it for dead.
superior. And I'm not sure if people like Albert Speer were great architects. They were clever people, but it's a lot more flowery and kind of ornate. And I'm not sure if it's part of the German classicism, whereas in Italy it's just simpler and kind of stronger.
I think so. And those German buildings seem to disempower you as the viewer. I mean, if you take something like the Air Ministry, you know, that building,
Yes.
I think it's whatever it's called now in Berlin. I mean, the corner of it where the entrance court is in my opinion, extremely good. But then the rest of the bloody thing is a 100-storey building laid horizontally, and it's endless, and it is actually intimidating to the viewer.
I read a fabulous book last year it's called Stalin's Architect.
Oh!
And it was about Stalin's architect who survived and didn't get shot. And it was a book about I forget his name, but he was an ambitious, talented architect. And it was really about how he survived the Stalinistic era. And it showed, and he was a clever architect, it showed him a drawing that he did, and then he showed it to Stalin, and Stalin would add a few bits. And then he'll try and work that, and he'll show it to Stalin again, he'll add a few more bits. And so, you know, people like Stalin were really, they used their architects as a way of power.
Yeah, it's politicising architecture.
I don't think architecture hasn't changed too much nowadays, and we've probably been lucky in Australia that we had someone like Paul Keating who was really interested in architecture.
An amazing self-educated man.
And pushed a lot of really great things in Sydney.
Yeah.
And a lot of architects say, but I think, well, at least he was interested. At least he made some things that were really good.
Yeah, no, Keating had taste, and he interested me, of course, because he loved a favourite architect of mine who's neoclassical with a major twist, which is Friedrich Schinkel. Because Schinkel, to me, is exquisite. I mean, the handling of mass, and then the fact that you get these neoclassical facades, and behind it is, in fact, a factory in steel. I mean, it's wonderful thinking so far ahead of its time. But yeah, Keating was an interesting sort of a guy. So
I probably should say it, we don't talk about politics, but
we just did.
Paul Keating is still probably, and I've lived in Australia for 35 years, but Paul Keating is probably still my favourite Australian politician, because I kind of understood what he meant.
Yeah, me too.
And I think now it's all kind of, it's gone, fractional and this and that, and whereas Paul, he had a vision for Australia that I thought was really intriguing.
Yeah, I agree, but we better stop there before we alienate anybody. So come on, pick a subject. I don't know how much longer we've got before we bore the pants off people. What do you think?
I've actually been reading a lot lately, Tony. And probably the kind of most interesting book I read was the book on Elon Musk. Talk about.
Oh yeah, okay.
Which, as Isaac said, was the.
I can't stand him, so I'll be
well,
intrigued. You can give me a pricey.
Look, it's quite apparent that he's not a particularly nice man, but what is also quite apparent is that he's a savant and really clever.
Ah.
But I was kind of more interested. It's a book about that, and it's written in bite-sized chapters that it's easy to read.
Digestible.
And I was kind of really intrigued how such a big book can be so easy to read. Yeah. The other book I read was on Anne Fleming.
Oh right.
That was written by Robert Shakespeare, I think. And again, it's a really fat book. And once you're in it, you can't let it go. And Anne Fleming, he was a troubled man. He had an issue with his mum and with all the females in his life. But thanks to him, we have James Bond, and
And I love James Bond as long as Sean Connery was in it, at any rate. So, well, that's interesting. I should maybe take a leaf out of your reading book. Mine's a little bit drier. I got 5 books to read over Christmas, and one of them was a dictionary of Maya hieroglyphics.
Oh, okay.
So I can probably look at Maya stuff and read it to a point. Another one was on the Assyrian Empire. Koos, we should maybe swap books. What do you think?
Oh, we should.
Perhaps we should. Yeah, because I'm besotted by Mayan architecture.
It's amazing, Tony. What actually gets me is I always bring the books that I read, I bring them into my office and I put them on the shelf, and I tell everyone, if you see a book that you like, take the book, because I think it's really important to share.
Absolutely.
But what struck me is certainly in Melbourne, we've got 95 kids there in the office. There's one person that reads. No one else reads. There are very few people that read.
Yeah, and I still love the tactility of a book. It's a sensuous experience going back and forth. The touch of paper. Sorry, I'm
As you
an
know,
analog guy.
I live in country Victoria most of the time, and I was telling my personal trainer about a fortnight ago. He said, "What are you doing today?" I said, "Oh, look, after gym, I'll probably go to the library." He said, "What are you going to the library for?" I said, "To get some books." He said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because I like books." But there's a whole cohort of people there that just don't read.
Yeah, well, I read vociferously. Just colossal. Sitting out in the garden and reading, it's one of the great pleasures of life. And coming in contact with other minds, it's a marvellous thing. And like you, I can never, ever throw a book away. If it's not going to stay in my library, and there's quite a few that stay, it has to be passed on.
Yeah.
They're people, and they need to be passed around gently.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of, who was it? Oh gosh, who was it that said, "Where they burn books, they will burn people"? Who was that?
Well, the Nazis burned books.
Yeah, I know, and this was that was prescient. That was well, it's eluded me. He was a poet.
I'm not sure, but it's a very good quote.
It's a good quote, isn't it?
Because the nice thing about reading is you don't necessarily have to agree with everything the writer says. I'm actually reading Martin Amis now, and it's actually very easy to read, and big thick books, and you read it and you say, "I'm not quite sure I agree with that, but I kind of like the idea." So it kind of opens up a world of thinking to you, and a lot of people don't like that.
A lot of people don't like that because, in all honesty, this is getting very frank, I'm a very opinionated person. I like to be contradicted.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I don't learn anything. And I want to learn. And that's what books and certain people do for me, is they change my thought processes, change what I think about something. They confront me, and it's a very necessary thing.
And just coming back to architecture, I think that's what's so great about architecture also, is that there's a lot of new architecture in Sydney here and right throughout Australia where you say, well, I'm not sure about that, but it's kind of really interesting. And so I think a lot of good architecture can be quite confronting.
Should be.
Where you say, geez, oh, yeah. Oh.
Should be. Well, look at the Sirius building, which I always liked. Look at the Masonic building downtown in Sydney. What's that old? Who did that? That was they've gone to God, but that was a fabulous
Wasn't Stevenson Turner? Was it Stevenson Turner? No.
I can't. But that building is magnificent.
Yes.
On anywhere in the world, absolutely magnificent.
Is that the one that's been pulled down now?
No. That's the Masonic temple, and that goes in and then expands out into the tower.
I think you'll find they've got it's been pulled down.
Hoffer Reed. I think it was Hoffer Reed. I used to know Frank Hoffer. Did you ever know Frank Hoffer?
No, it's probably before.
No, he was a bloody good guy.
I think that building is about to go.
That's the disaster. It's a masterpiece.
Well, and I totally agree. I think it's great that Sirius was kept. I think brutalism is a really interesting period of architecture.
Absolutely.
It's very authentic, and the thing I like about it is that a lot of it's just off from a concrete. It's just poured. They take the precasts, and it's really this authentic, honest materiality.
Yeah.
And as an architect today in 2024 in Sydney, what I tell all the kids that work for me is that we're not going to agree to a painted concrete building.
Look, you've hit another nail on the head. I mean, Mies van der Rohe said concrete was the stone of the 20th century and also the 21st, frankly, as we're there now. But when I look at, for instance, a building which I consider, here's a sculpture, Harry Seidler's Horizon, which to me is exquisite from every angle. I think the apartments internally are a bit strange, but nonetheless, the building as a sculpture is magnificent. It was so much better before they painted it white.
There's not much that Harry has done that I haven't liked, and Harry is a very fine architect.
Absolutely, and how bloody lucky we were to have him. I think we've just about hit 25 minutes. Top her up and let's give everybody that bothers to sit through this a cheers. What do you reckon? Oh.
I kind of like what you said about opinionated people, about opinions. I think opinions are really important.
Of course they're important.
Yeah.
There we go.
Cheers.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this rave, and we'll carry on without you, actually. Bye-bye.